With a week to go, US President Joe Biden sticks to the August 31st deadline to leave Afghanistan for good. We will take a look at the political fallout of his decision. Hello, I'm Nathan King, sitting in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. Hello again. US President Joe Biden held a virtual meeting on Tuesday with G7 leaders to discuss the best way to evacuate assets and people from Afghanistan. Biden has been criticized by analysts for the way American troops are being withdrawn from the country, and also criticized, of course, here in the US. Some politicians, you can see in this tweet in the Republican Party, are even using the I word, impeachment, calling him unfit to be president. Biden spoke out about the situation in Afghanistan and said that every American who wants to leave the country will be able to do so before the August 31st deadline. Caroline Malone has these details.
They didn't get the results they were hoping for. G7 leaders, including France, Britain and Germany, held a video call with the US President Joe Biden as frantic evacuations of their citizens and Afghan allies continue from Kabul. After the meeting, Biden said he's not extending an August 31st deadline to get US troops out of Afghanistan.
We are currently on a pace to finish by August the 31st. The sooner we can finish, the better. Each day of operations brings added risk to our troops. But the completion by August 31st depends upon the Taliban continuing to cooperate.
UK's Prime Minister Boris Johnson and other G7 members had wanted the US to extend the deadline to ensure a level of security to get their own citizens and Afghan allies out on flights. European leaders have also repeatedly emphasized how important it is for the Taliban to let people out, even after the deadline.
The number one condition we're setting as G7 is that they've got to guarantee right the way through August the 31st and beyond, safe passage for those who want to come out. Now, someone will say that they don't accept that, and some of them, I hope, will see the sense of that, because the G7 has very considerable leverage, economic, diplomatic, and political.
G7 leaders also discussed how they'll deal with the Taliban going forward, but there are already concerns over whether the Taliban will respect international relations. From the Taliban's perspective, the US made an agreement to be out by August 31st, and its leaders say if that doesn't happen, the US will face unspecified consequences. US President Biden said they are on track and have already evacuated more than 70,000 people from Kabul since August 14. But there are believed to be thousands more Americans waiting to be airlifted out, as well as many Afghans that want to be evacuated, all with a deadline of 1 week. Caroline Malone, CGTN, Washington.
Well, there's a lot to discuss. Let's bring in our panelists. From Long Island, New York, is Frank Sesno, the Director of Strategic Initiatives at the George Washington University School of Media and Public Affairs and former CNN Bureau Chief in Washington. From McLean in Virginia, not far away, John Sitilides. He's a good friend of the show, Geopolitical Strategist at Trilogy Advisor. Another good friend of the show, Atiba Madyun, is the President and Founder of Party Politics US. He joins us here in DC. And from New York, we have Adam Weinstein. He is a research fellow at the Quincy Institute and a former US Marine deployed to Afghanistan. Welcome to you all. Adam, I'm going to start with you. Obviously, your experience on the ground is going to be very valuable for our discussion here today. Now that the US is withdrawing, could you ever imagine it being this chaotic?
Well, I think it's a little bit more chaotic than folks expected, but we have to remember that this chaos is the natural consequence of the intervention and misguided policies that I think have shaped the U.S. mission over the last 20 years. Whenever you're engaged in an intervention abroad, it's possible that unpredictable circumstances can arise and then chaos will follow.
Just to follow up on that, you're basically saying because there was no sort of local ally on the ground for 20 years, essentially when you decide to leave, you've got no friends.
Well, I'm not sure I'd go that far. We did have partners on the ground, but I don't think people foresaw such a precipitous collapse. I don't think regional countries predicted this. I don't think China or Russia predicted this, and I don't think the United States did either. I think the collapse of the Afghan government was much more rapid than what folks thought would happen, and that's why we're seeing some of this chaos.
Yeah, let's go to John now, because we've seen a lot of tension between NATO allies, who are also part of the G7, that we saw a virtual call with Joe Biden and chaired by Boris Johnson, the British Prime Minister. And essentially, they want an extension of this August 31st deadline for pulling out, because they don't know if they can extract all their nationals and, of course, Afghans that have helped and others that they want to bring out in time. Joe Biden, the US president, sticking by it, but also saying he's going to be flexible. What's the White House messaging here to allies and also on the domestic front?
An extraordinarily mixed one, Nathan.
Yeah.
First, if I can just hit the original point that you asked the previous panelist, I think one of the things that we've discovered is the dirty secret of the US intervention in Afghanistan is that the US government was essentially a giant NGO. There was no Afghan state, and there was no independent, motivated Afghan army. And this is why everything melted so quickly in the last several weeks. But on the issue of Washington relations with NATO, look, our NATO allies made some very important sacrifices. Hundreds of soldiers died on behalf of this NATO mission. And it was a NATO mission going back to the Article 5 treaty call after the Taliban allowed al-Qaeda to strike the US in 2001.
That's right.
These leaders have very important responsibilities to their constituencies. And I think the fact that Joe Biden made a big deal about the alliance is back, the US is back, and Europe would be a primary concern, and now apparently lack of consultation in withdrawing these forces and allowing European citizens to also be exposed with Americans is a very great problem now in the Washington relationship with our allies.
Atiba, I want to hit the domestic point with you, because the White House knows the polling on Afghanistan, and it's usually about 70% or more that just want to basically end this forever war, the longest war in US history. But they are getting a lot of criticism, the White House, and even from Democrats and Republicans. Is this going to be a political problem, as, of course, Joe Biden focuses on his very ambitious domestic agenda? Or do you think the feeling in the White House that they can shrug this off in a couple of months, given any disaster that doesn't happen in the next few days, and move on?
I think the president recognizes that what he did is he put the burden of this on his shoulders. He said in his first statement about this that he did not want to turn this over to another president. So, the optics of this looks really bad. The conversations that I'm having with friends and former military and contractors who've been in Afghanistan is very hard. I mean, their hearts are broken to see what's going on there. But as you mentioned, 70% of the American people want to see our troops come back home. The withdrawal and the way that this is all broken down, the way that the collapse of the Afghan government, no one anticipated this. So the president, the buck stops with him. This is something that's going to be long term. This is going to be something where the Democrats are going to look for cover because they're looking ahead at the 2022 midterms. Republicans are going to look at this as a political strategy to beat up the president. But this is also tied to the last administration in terms of the negotiations that were put in place for us to leave Afghanistan. So this is it's a messy problem. It's one that this is why you become president. You have to accept this responsibility. Right. But it's not one that there's no easy answer to this. But it's a good thing that our troops are coming home. But I think we keep talking about this deadline. What I do think that we need to be looking at is what's going to happen come the 28th and 29th. How many of our people are going to be out of there, because it does look like they're going to have to extend it, but the president did double down today.
I just want to follow up with you, Atiba. The polling seems to put him under 50% for the first time in his presidency, especially when you count Afghanistan in there. Look, American history is littered with withdrawal from foreign climes and it hitting the polls. As we know, one president decided against running against re-election. One even lobbied with a foreign power to make peace talks in Vietnam stall until he was elected. So this is not new. But could this be an albatross around the neck of President Biden in the midterms, or do you think the timing in terms of where we are, sort of middle of 2021, things will have been largely forgotten given the attention span in the 24/7 media we live in?
I was going to say, if people have a short attention span, where we're going to be in the next few months, we're still in the middle of a pandemic.
Yeah.
And this pandemic is one that the president is also having to wrestle with. And we've got, this pandemic of the unvaccinated. So we don't know where we're going to be in January, February of next year, because we still have to go through the fall with the pandemic. Right now, I'm also focused on what's going to happen around as we get closer to 9/11. There's been a lot of chatter that we've heard from national security, that there's been a lot of chatter as we get closer to the 20-year anniversary of 9/11. So there's a lot of things. The president has a lot of things going, but Afghanistan and how he's going to get our troops, how he's going to get those American citizens, as well as these refugees home. What is going to also be a big part of the conversation in the midterms is going to be the refugees who are coming in, and how they are brought into our society, into our culture, and we've got culture wars that are going on, and this is just another one that's going to precipitate a bigger argument as we get into 2022.
And also the treatment of women there left in Afghanistan. I think that's going to be a big barometer, especially in the media. Talking of the media, Frank, thanks for waiting. This is quite an incredible media moment, because you've seen some incredible reporting, including some of the reporters that worked at your former channel, CNN. This is personal for a lot of them, isn't it? Because they've worked in Afghanistan, they've used translators, they have producers. You can really tell that there is a moment there of, especially the international media, of really scratching their heads about this. And, Joe Biden and the Democrats are sort of sometimes unfairly potentially accused of getting a free pass from the media. That's certainly not the case here, is it?
It's not the case, and it won't be the case. You were just having the conversation about the political elements of this and the political risk, and that ties directly to the media component of this, because this story and these events and the future are all so unpredictable that the real political liability for Joe Biden lies in what happens after August 31st. What happens with people who are inevitably left behind? What happens with Afghan citizens, or, by the way, Afghan nationals who were freelancers or journalists or worked and told the story, and they get left behind? Are they left alone, or are they brutalized? Are they taken hostage, or are they given some degree of freedom? We don't know, but there are a lot of things that could happen. People taken hostage, people left behind, terrorism reconstituting. All of those are gigantic media stories if they happen. The idea that Joe Biden somehow moves on, and even the media moves on, once the Americans are evacuated, I think is a big miscalculation, because there's so much that can go wrong here. And that will instantly feed a media narrative that will haunt Biden and, frankly, everybody in power right now for the rest of their terms, potentially. Think about the hostage coverage that we had.
Yes, I was just about to follow up with that. Although
that doesn't go away.
Although, Frank, I'm going to follow up with you because I'm not so sure the American media will stay in Afghanistan, just given my experience of how long people stay in zones when other stories happen, as you know. But I admire your optimism. But in
no. I'm not saying that they'll stay there. What I'm saying is that if things go south, if things go very bad, that story will come back. Now, we have a short attention span in the media, and people are ready to move on to the next crisis. What I'm suggesting is this crisis is by no means over and won't be on August 31st. I think there are all kinds of potential landmines, literal and figurative here, that can explode and blow up both politics and media coverage.
Yeah, I know your career, despite how your youthful look spans decades, and you remember, of course, those images of from the Saigon lifting off from the CIA headquarters, part of the embassy, et cetera, et cetera. But there are other examples too, where presidents have had terrible crises. I'm thinking of Lebanon with Reagan and the Marine barracks being blown up and the peacekeepers. I'm thinking of Somalia and Bill Clinton. Presidents seem to shake off these foreign policy crises, especially when, I hate to say it this way, when non-Americans bear the brunt.
Yes, but sometimes it's a question of the president appearing to lose control, and that works terribly. Jimmy Carter was defeated by American hostages held for 444 days in Iran.
And it was on TV every night, wasn't it? They listed the names every night. And
every night, the coverage, the media coverage was America held hostage. What happens if a terrorist threat reconstitutes itself in Afghanistan, or God forbid something bad happens there or elsewhere? Joe Biden is going to be held responsible for that, and the media coverage will instantly, connect those dots. It's a very perilous time.
Thanks for that, Frank. I want to go back to Adam, because I want to move this on in terms of lessons learned here. Obviously there's going to be some domestic fallout, but the big fallout for me is this going to change American policy when it comes to intervention and this sort of wishful thinking when it comes to interventions and staying and nation building? Do you think the US is just essentially done right now? Are we moving to a sort of American isolation, feeling maybe a lighter footprint around the world, or is it just a refocus to Asia?
Well, I hope that we've learned the lessons of intervention, and I don't view the opposite of intervention as isolation. I think there's a way for the United States to engage in the world through diplomacy, through development that doesn't revolve around military intervention. I think we also have to remember, when we discuss the fallout of this evacuation and the events that might transpire in the months to come, that it wasn't as if the alternative was going to be a very good situation either. The Taliban were making consistent gains on the ground. That's why they were able to make such a rapid advance when foreign troops left. That was a consolidation of gains that had been made over many years, and they would have re-engaged with U.S. troops, and there would have probably been U.S. casualties. And that would have been something that President Biden would have had to answer to as well. So I think we have to remember that. Big picture, though, I think future presidents are going to think twice before engaging in a military intervention abroad. That doesn't mean disengaging from the world, though. Okay, because you remember Biden's tour of Europe and elsewhere, America is back, it's not America first or America alone. But this doesn't quite sit right, especially if you watch the parliamentary debates in Westminster, for example. I mean, we didn't even see that language during the Trump administration and relations with trade. So what happens here? Well, look, I think Europe is going to have to adjust, and I think some of the harsh criticism we've seen coming out of European governments has to do with their domestic audience as well. Many of these countries sold their participation in this war in Afghanistan based on human rights grounds and other things, and it's difficult for them to simply say to their own citizens that, well, we're coming home and we don't have much to show for it. Of course, this is the problem with interventions to begin with, and the way countries delude themselves about why they're engaged in an intervention, and that applies to American partners as well. Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent point. The stories you tell yourself are often the wrong ones. That's a really, really good point going forward. John, I just want to come back to you, because obviously the midterms are coming up next year, even though we're on a perpetual election cycle always here in the United States. The Republicans are very much sort of focused on the culture wars, if you like, and also the battle over mask wearing, COVID mandates, etc. Is Afghanistan anywhere on their radar in terms of being able to wound Biden and the Democratic Party, or do you think after their criticisms on the usual thing, hordes of immigrant refugees, etc., they'll focus on bread and butter issues?
Well, partisanship is a normal part of the foreign policy debate in the United States.
I thought it stopped at the water's edge, John. It was to stop at the water's edge.
I think there are so many uncertainties after August 31. I'm actually very concerned that we're about to enter a long-term, massive American hostage crisis. I have no reason to believe that we're going to get most of those thousands of Americans out in the next week. And I see no reason why the Taliban won't exploit their presence in Afghanistan to humiliate Washington, probably with the approval of Moscow and of Beijing as well. So I think this may be with us, maybe even beyond the 2022 elections, and this will be the biggest issue in American politics all of next year if thousands of Americans are hostage in Afghanistan.
Right. I know some right-wing shows have said they're already hostage if they can't get to the airport. So it's very interesting. Atiba, I want to bring you in here and play before your answer. Nikki Haley, as you know, the former UN ambassador for the Trump administration, widely tipped to be a possible candidate if Trump doesn't come back for the Republican nomination for 2024. Let's listen to her take on it, because she's very much pointing the finger at the Biden administration.
They're not negotiating with the Taliban. They've completely surrendered to the Taliban. They surrendered Bagram Air Force Base, which was a major NATO hub. They surrendered $85 billion worth of equipment and weapons that we should have gotten out of there. They have surrendered the American people and actually withdrew our troops before they withdrew the American people. And they've abandoned our Afghan allies who kept people like my husband safe while they were overseas deploying. So, no, there was no negotiating. This was a complete and total surrender and an embarrassing failure.
Atiba, that's real red meat for the Republican Party there, no matter what you feel. Has that got legs, or do you think she's barking up the wrong tree here?
Well, you know, there's that saying, a lie travels halfway around the world before the truth has a chance to put its pants on. And
yes.
Yeah, and so right now you have the Republicans are going to try to take a moral high ground and make this a political situation when it's really, to me, it's an American situation. Bottom line is we've got Democrats, Republicans, independents. We've just got Americans there that we want to make sure that they get home safely. That's the bottom line. Whether or not, you know, this language saying that we surrendered, well, let's not forget that John Bolton was enraged by the last president because he considered bringing the Taliban to Camp David for a meeting on the week of 9/11. So, you know, there's so many different things in the narrative, and we have a short-term memory in this country. So I think that, you know, in terms of the Democrats wanting to have a hearing or talk about this, it's important for us to get the facts straight. But as the panelists have also mentioned, you know, right now, the focus right now should be on August 31st. The focus should be on what's happening, you know, literally, you know, and figuratively, these landmines. And the president got a big win today. Congress passed a $3.5 trillion infrastructure bill. That's already not even being really talked about because we're still talking about Afghanistan, where our focus should be. But, you know, the other part of this politically is when people have short-term memories, they're also going to be thinking about what's in their pockets and how the economy is working and whether or not we're coming out of this pandemic. You know, we don't know where we're going to be in the next few weeks, let alone the next few days. But what we do need to focus on right now is protecting the lives of our American citizens and getting our allies, those people who've been on the ground in Afghanistan, helping our men and women for the last 20 years.
But there's a larger point here, isn't there, Atiba? And I'm going to play a clip from Sheila Jackson-Lee at the moment, because, you know, the Biden administration came in and said, we're going to put human rights at the heart of our foreign policy. We're going to care about authoritarianism. We care about women and children's rights, etc. But that's really not what we're seeing, especially around the airport in Afghanistan, and really not a priority as American troops roll out. Let's just play this clip, and I'll get yours and John's reaction off the bat.
I have joined in the message to the president today that we must move beyond August 31st. We cannot leave without an even-handed, safe, and peaceful transition and evacuation of our friends and our fellow Americans.
Atiba, what does that say to, you know, the Party of Democrats essentially being, you know, attuned to human rights?
Well, you know, here's the bottom line. We've got women and children in Afghanistan, in a country that, in my opinion, has still been stuck in the past.
Right.
You know, a lot of questions I have is what happened in terms of, we talked about being there. We basically were trying to colonize a country. What happened to the $2 trillion that was spent there? We talk about there was $1 trillion spent on the military, but what about the Afghani people that are now, under the Taliban, what we know historically, the Taliban has been oppressive.
Right.
And using Islam as a means to oppress women and children.
Okay,
so from a humanitarian standpoint, I don't know exactly what it is that we can do aside from watch and wait and see what happens there and try to use our diplomacy and hopefully not our military again in Afghanistan.
Well, John, just to this point, you know, we've heard the real anger, especially from women's groups, that were supported and encouraged for 20 years by Americans who are just literally turning. and they feel very let down. I mean, is this something that could really affect America's standing in the world, perhaps more than domestic politics? And then I'm going to go to Adam.
No, I think we have to be very realistic about the conditions on the ground. I mean, let's be honest here. We have a population in Afghanistan, 95 to 98% of whom believe in Sharia law. We can't shoehorn American and Western cultural institutions into a 7th century tribal, underdeveloped culture and history of Afghanistan. It was a wonderful experience for these women all of these years, but we're not sending thousands and tens of thousands of Americans and NATO troops to defend women's rights in a country whose society is inimically opposed to Western concepts of human rights.
Point well taken. Although, by the way, Afghanistan has been a cradle for civilization. If you look at Herat, for example, amazing universities and once part of a pearl of the Persian Empire. But Adam, I'm going to get back to you. We've seen actually negotiations between CIA Director William Burns and the Taliban themselves. There are negotiations. Obviously, the Biden administration doesn't want you up front that they're shaking hands on anything. But is this tentative negotiations a good thing, especially considering the vacuum that's going to be left by American power on August 31st?
Look, I think any kind of diplomatic outreach is a good thing. I don't think it should be irresponsible or that we should write blank checks. I think the reason that you saw the CIA conducting the outreach with Mullah Baradar is because if you had an actual U.S. diplomat conducting that outreach, that would be sort of a de facto recognition of the Taliban as the legitimate government, which I don't think the United States is ready to do.
Diplomats not. Yeah, I get it.
So I think what's important is to continue some form of diplomatic mission. I think it would be a travesty to just disengage completely from Afghanistan or to transition to using sanctions and essentially holding 37 million to 40 million Afghans hostage to the fact that the Taliban have taken over the country. I think it's important that U.S. policy focuses on the people of Afghanistan.
Thank you. Last word, Frank. I'm going to be unfair on you here. In terms of foreign policy disasters, and you've seen a few, we've seen a few, where does this rank?
Well, this is way high. It's not just a disaster right now to see the chaos of trying to get people out. It's a 20-year debacle where the United States went in, first with a light touch to get al-Qaeda and then the Taliban from that, then to nation build, to bring in NATO, to rally the troops, if you will, of international support, to try to maintain American political support through it all, through, through all kinds of casualties and death and loss. And not only is there not a government that puts up a fight or a military that's left standing, you have just this sort of disastrous implosion. And I think the comment earlier that this was the United States playing NGO, Nikki Haley is right. And there will be political points to be made here, no matter how you parse through it. Trillions of dollars, billions of dollars of equipment, untold human investment and sacrifice. And God knows where the country's going to go. This is way high on the disaster list in terms of a foreign policy mission.
I really appreciate it. And that focus on the 20 years, not the 2 minutes of the news reporting that you might catch is very, very important for American citizens and everyone around the world. Thanks for a great panel, guys. I really appreciate it. That's it. This edition of The Heat. I'm Nathan King, Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for being with us. See you soon.